Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. And if you've been watching the news, you know that the world is in somewhat of a state of tumult and discomfort, let's say. So to get a different perspective on that, we thought tonight we would talk to someone and get a little bit from the spiritual perspective. Our guest tonight is the Reverend Erik Khoobyarian. Erik, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Let's start, though, with a little bit of background. You were not always a minister. You had another career before this. What drew you to the ministry initially?
Yeah, it's a good question. So yes, I was an attorney for 15 years.
Which some would say is like the polar opposite.
The opposite, right. But I would argue there are a lot of similarities. I practiced law in California. I think the bigger change for me was leaving California, where I was from, where I was raised, the culture in which I was familiar. And so when I was about 15 years, like I said, into my career, I realized that I had been preparing for this jump into ministry much of that time. What do I mean by that? My life in the church was a huge part of who I was. I was very active in my own local church, but then also in our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, which is the denomination that I'm now ordained in. And I realized that it was time for me to commit myself more fully to that work within the church. And it worked out timing-wise in my career and for me to say, all right, this is the chance I'll have. And so I left my job and moved across country to New Jersey to begin seminary at that time. So that was just about 4 years ago.
And how many of your friends, family, or others said, you're nuts, why are you doing that?
It's funny, I got differing reactions. From the ones who were closest to me, that was the reaction of a little bit of, what are you doing? Why are you leaving? You've got your career, why are you doing this? But the ones that I interacted with in my work at the law firm, and a few of the people I even was opposite on cases where lawyers on the other side were some of the most affirming, who said, that seems like a really good fit for you, I'm excited for you. And many of them came to my ordination service and were very supportive of me throughout that whole process. And so it's interesting how other people, sometimes people you might not think are obvious, can point out ways that make sense for you as they see characteristics in you.
Well, and they'd worked with you in a certain context, so they'd seen how you present yourself, and particularly as an attorney, where you're an advocate for someone, a person, a cause, whatever, and how you would advocate for that and how you would express that passion, essentially, for here's the story that needs to be told here. Was that part of what they saw, or was there something else that they picked up?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's part of it. I think the other piece of it, most specifically from the people I worked with at the law firm, was the way that I cared deeply for two things. One, walking alongside people through difficult situations. I was the one that would often go into a setting and talk with a client to explain to them how things were going to work. A lot of the people I represented were small business owners who may not be used to the legal system. They're used to running their business, whether it's a fencing company or some other small business. They're used to running their company. That's what they're doing. And then here they are now finding themselves in a lawsuit. And so I saw myself as walking alongside them on that journey through something that was otherwise frightening and intimidating, or at least something they didn't know how to do. I wasn't the one walking through it for them.
Right.
I was walking through it with them. And I see very much that being the role of a pastor.
I was just about to say, yes, that walking along, that guiding, that taking someone through a difficult time and helping them to understand what's happening, that's very much what a pastor's job is, right?
That's right. That's how I see a lot of what we're doing is shepherding, in a sense, guiding, walking alongside with other people through the challenges of their life.
Well, so now you've left that career. You spent 3 years in seminary, and now you've had a year on the job. So,
that's right.
So how is it what you expected, and how is it different?
Yeah, I think the key thing that I've been thinking about as this first year wrapped up and beginning to think about the future now is that a lot of that first year really was spent getting to know people, but also understanding the community that I was in, both the geographic community, the people within the area surrounding the church, and then also the community, the ethos within the church. What are the values of this church? What do people care about? And then also asking the question, not just where we are, but where do we want to go? What do we want to be? Who do we want to be as a church? And those are questions that I couldn't ask a year ago. I had to observe, and I had to walk in the shoes and go through a cycle of a year in the life of the church. And so that for me has been an important piece. And then also trying to walk softly that line between leading and guiding the process and turning the church into what I want it to be. That's not my desire in any way. And so figuring out how to do that, I think, is
Well, I would think
key.
it'd be especially difficult because any church, and by the way, in the interest of full disclosure, we should tell our audience that I am, in fact, a member of the church
That's
where
right.
you are the pastor.
Yeah.
But any church is comprised of multiple, quite disparate individuals. And so getting a common sense of anything from this wide group, and although it's not a huge congregation, 150 people, have 150 different opinions.
Right.
And so being able to marshal that into something coherent, what kind of challenges, how do you approach that? Even now, after a year, how do you approach trying to find a commonality?
Yeah, I think one key thing is spending a lot of time listening and then also observing. And so I think one of the things that I'm trying to do now, this is a new thing I'll be doing in the next few months, is sharing what my observations are about certain things or values in the church, and then hearing people's response to that. And I think what I'm finding is that you have people in a church, in any church, who have been members for a very long time, and some of their memories are translated into the present. In other words, they'll think that the church is a certain size. Well, yes, it was that size maybe in 1990, but it's not today. And looking at the things we do and how we are focused based on our present reality and helping people to see that. The other thing is getting people to talk to each other. Because,
What a concept.
Yeah, because sometimes people have an idea of what they want to be doing or where they think we should be going, and they haven't talked through it with other people, and they find out when they start talking that there's some synergies, there's some alignments there that they can join one another and get behind.
So toward that end, and I grew up in a different faith tradition in Catholic Church where basically people showed up for church and went home.
Right.
And that was kind of, you showed up, you were there for an hour, and you went on about your life. And what I see in the Presbyterian Church, and this may be just this particular church or maybe Presbyterian USA as a whole, is the level of involvement of the members of the congregation, which is surprising to me. I mean, it's a good thing, but it's something I find unusual. And so being able to kind of understand that, as you say, to observe it, understand what it is, and then marshal it really, kind of, not so much as, constrain it, but marshal it in one or another direction, would seem to me to be a difficult thing that may take time and, in the software world where I spend much of my life, we would call it iterative development. You go through and see how it works, and then you make changes because some of it works and some of it doesn't. So is that sort of how you see this as well, or this is kind of an iterative process where you'll get a sense, see, okay, this seems to be good, and sort of move in a direction and see how that's working. And then maybe it's not, maybe it is, maybe there's some changes.
No, I think that's a great way to put it, and I think that borrowing from the technology realm is a good way to analogize, because we really are trying different things and then also always examining what we're doing so that we can be adapting and changing and coming out with our new versions of ourselves.
Right.
And if we don't, we do get stuck in basic A. And you see that a lot, where we'll have a program in a church that we've been doing for a very long time. And why are we doing it? We're doing it because we've always done it. And so giving people the freedom and the forgiveness to say, that program or that activity we were doing, it was great for a long time. We are grateful for the way that it engaged us, but now it's time to let that go and see what new things will come about. And for me, when I look at programs within a church, or if we want to use programs to mean anything that we're doing, my question is always going to be, how is this enabling us to grow in faith and to grow in living out our faith in the world? And that goes back to what you were saying about this idea of church being a 1 hour a week kind of a place. Actually, many churches have even stopped being that, right? People go periodically to church.
Right.
But the idea for me of what church is meant to be is to take and be a catalyst in a way, so that we are a place where you don't leave your faith behind. We don't want you to leave it in your pew. Our goal is that you take it with you. And one of the things I repeat often is this idea that we need to be not partitioning out our lives and have our life that we have in church, where we learn about how we treat other people, and then we go out into the world and we ignore that, or we live differently, or we go into the business world, or we go into our car and we're in traffic, and how do we treat people? You know, the biggest challenge I see for the church now is being authentic to people. And I look at children, for instance, and if children hear about loving others and caring about others, and then they, in church, and then they go home and they're not seeing that loving and caring attitude even between parents, or between parents and the children, or the way that parents behave elsewhere, they're not going to see kind of that authenticity
Well, I like
in action.
and I like that word, authenticity, and the authentic experience, because my jaded view of things, so much of what I have seen in my life, it seems to me to be the form over the substance, and not just in some previous churches I belonged to, but I think generally, I've spent a lot of time in the political world, and I see a lot of posing, people who want to present a persona of some sort, and they may actually be something quite different. And so I like this idea of authenticity, that, like, look, let's examine who you are, who I am, as individual people, and even if it's not so much faith related directly, it's personal integrity.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And how do we find that and then live that out?
Yeah. And you're touching on another piece of it, which is a vulnerability that comes with that. Because we do spend a lot of our time building up an image of ourselves that we want the world to see, that we want others to see. And one of the other pieces that I think is so critical is peeling back these layers of the masks that we put on, and allowing who we are, who our true self is, to be shared with others. And that's hard to do.
It's very scary.
But once we do it, I think we find that we're able to know ourselves better, know others better, and my perspective is that we then also begin to know the divine better, that our goal through all of this is to be living a life that is more
in tune,
complete and more full.
and more in tune with divine will.
And then the next step also, I think, does become, in this progression, becomes it's one thing to have that interpersonal relationship, but then how am I living out my faith in the world? And one of the pieces that I think in the introduction you mentioned, this difficult world that we live in, I feel like there's two things going on in the life of the church from my perspective. One is this very individualized approach that I'm trying to take of helping people be vulnerable, be authentic with one another. So growing as individuals. But then there's this other piece that the church has wrestled with for a very long time, which is, how do we interact with the world? How do we interact with the problems that we see in the world? And how do we as a church be a catalyst there too for change in the world?
Well, and prior to the show, you and I had discussed the history of the civil rights movement, for example, when the African American churches took a leading role in trying to say, look, this is not, this is a matter of everyday life, and everyone needs to look at this and think about this. You know, in order to be, moral beings, we have to recognize that, back in the 60s when, blacks couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as whites, they couldn't sit in the same bus seats, and, these horrible segregation. And although things are, certainly not perfect today, there at least some of those major problems have been solved. But that happened largely because of leadership from the black churches who were able to get the idea across even to white America that these are moral issues, and that as moral beings, if we want to see ourselves as such, that we have to understand that there is an injustice here that needs to be corrected. Now, that was very difficult. I mean, as you know, the people in the civil rights movement, some of them paid heavy prices. But yet, the message did get conveyed. And so in today's world, where we're seeing a resurgence of some of these dark forces, what is the message that a church can preach and not, I mean, the fear is always, well, we don't want to take a political stand, and if I say this and that, or, it's going to make one group angry or another group angry. But nonetheless, it seems to me that the kind of moral issues are the same, or they're similar, a repeat of what we've seen before. And how does the church address those in a way that can actually reach people without sounding like there's an agenda other than just simple human justice?
Yeah, two things. One, I picked up on, you said, how does the church do this? The key is the church has to do it. It is not an option for the church to ignore the injustice in the world. Yes, it can be difficult, and there are ways that a pastor can choose an easy path, which is to be aggressive on a political issue, and they will divide, and they will cause there to be splits in churches and all of those things. And many pastors take that path and they say, I want to be, I don't mind that, it's okay to have that, I want to hold firm. I take a little bit of a different perspective, which is one that tries to move the whole ship. We're going to try to move the whole ship, to be a part of a team that sees the world through the eyes of the gospel and the message of Christ. Christ's message was really quite clear, even though it's gotten diluted quite a bit by churches throughout history and by churches today. But really, it was clear. It was standing up for those who are marginalized, standing up for those who the government chooses to treat wrongly or poorly, standing in the face of injustice. Interestingly, I don't have the exact numbers, but the word forgiveness comes up several times in Scripture, but the word justice comes up hundreds of times throughout the Old and New Testament. And so if we're only talking about forgiveness and telling victims that they need to be comforted and forgive, then we're missing something that is much stronger than that, which is this call for justice. And what does it mean? What does it look like for us to be about the work of justice? Now, it's hard to do. It's hard to do in the context, especially in the context in which we operate, in the suburban context. Because what does it mean for a small white suburban church to be about the work of especially racial justice or other injustices? And I will tell you that for me, there are two pieces that I think of. One is education and learning, and then the second one is asking and seeing what can we do. So I give the example of the learning. Several of the women in the church who are involved in a group called Presbyterian Women have been reading a few books on race relations, and they've spent the last couple of years focusing on this as an area that they've said we want to learn more and grow more as to how we can be a part of change. And they've had discussions, and they've had hard discussions about these topics. And then they've had times where they've been able to talk with folks of other races than them, people who are in different socioeconomic, living in different environments. And one of the things that I remember hearing recently was someone saying, we want to be able to do more. We want to be able to fix. Well, that's the problem, is that sometimes we, in positions of or places of privilege, want to be the ones to fix things. Well, the answer isn't always to fix, unfortunately.
And I think the other point of that is that we want to fix someone else.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good point.
And it's really us.
Yeah.
We need to fix ourselves.
Yeah.
In fact, now I forget which one. There was one of the Democratic presidential candidates who came out and said, look, we have to speak to white people. And it was a white candidate. He said, we have to speak to white people about racism. We can't be telling minorities what they have to do. It's like they're the ones who are the recipients of this. We're the ones who are, in most cases, it's white people who are on the giving out end of the racism. And so we have to talk to ourselves and figure out how do we change each of us individually. Now this, I think, comes back to your earlier statement about authenticity and how to understand authentically who you are. And even in this case, how often do we as privileged white people think in what are really, to say most kindly, racially insensitive terms without even realizing it? And how does that manifest then? Because thoughts become things. So how does that manifest itself in everyday real action? And so to me, the idea is to follow this idea of authenticity and really individual exposure.
Self-examination.
Self-examination. To see where is this connection and how am I contributing to this problem? And how can I alternatively contribute to the solution?
I wonder if you've ever taken any of the implicit bias tests. Have you ever done any of these?
I haven't, but I am sure I'd have
They're
some.
fascinating. You can find them by typically looking on the internet, find these free tests, and they essentially will be word associations or sometimes visual images, and they can be like any test that you take, results can go either way in terms of how helpful they really are. But for me, it was very awakening just to help me to see how I see the world. And it, I think, is a piece of this step of saying, let me do some self-examination. One of the things that I think can be a dangerous path, though, for us is to put on other people the responsibility for telling us what we need to be doing. Does that make sense? Especially going to folks who have been underrepresented or oppressed and putting the pressure on them to tell us what to do or educate us about the ways you are suffering discrimination. And that can be a further tax on them.
It takes the responsibility off of us and puts it on them. And I think that the one place where there might be some amelioration of that is just that if we really don't know, someone has to be able to tell us, oh, when you do such and such, here's how I would interpret that. That's helpful. But you're right, it's not, the conversation, to my mind, has been misdirected in terms of the people who are suffering this, and it needs to be redirected back to the people who are doing this, and in many cases without even realizing it. I also want to come back to something you said, you were talking about earlier, which is the concept of justice. And I think in this, especially in this context, it's very hard to define what justice is. There are those who might look at that and say, well, justice is vengeance. I need to, they did something and now justice says I need to do this. And that's not really what we're talking about here in terms of justice, is it?
Well, sometimes it can be. I did tell a story once about a judge that I worked for, and during sentencing, he always would ask these federal inmates, do you have anything you want to say? And one time, and this judge was very level-headed, a very cool man. One time someone said to him, I just want justice. And it lit the judge up. He got very angry and less angry and just much more animated than he normally was. Well, no, he said to him, do you really want justice? Is that what you want? Because you committed this crime, you've admitted that you committed this crime, justice would be a lot of time for you in prison. Is that what you want? And he says, I think what you want is grace, you want leniency, you want kindness, but I don't think you want justice.
Interesting.
And I thought that was fascinating. And I talked to him about it afterward.
First of all, what did the guy say, the guy who was standing in front of him?
I don't know that he understood what was happening, and he did acknowledge, I just want, I want you to be as little as you can. And so I brought it up with the judge. I said, I thought that was fascinating that you were so firm on this, of not wanting wanting to be clear about what does justice mean. And when I asked him, what do you think justice means? And for him, justice really meant a leveling of the law, of the playing field, and getting what you deserve, and not more and not less. And I thought that was interesting, and it then has stayed with me, because now you say, and that's not too far off of your first definition of justice, but when you say that's not really what we're talking about, well, I do think it is, but what we have are structures that are themselves systemically unjust. And so in that situation, it's not that we want things to be a level playing field according to the rules that are in place. It's that in some cases we have to undo these systems that are themselves unjust. So our denomination picked an issue that we haven't talked much about at our church, but the larger denomination has been working on, which is the removal or the elimination of cash bail systems. And the concept being that when individuals are arrested and they have to put up bail to be able to get out for pending trial, these systems make it so that the lower socioeconomic individuals are never going to be able to pay the cash. They're never going to be able to do it, so they stay in prison or in jail far longer than they otherwise would. And so what our denomination did at the national gathering, they took an offering, they raised money, and they went and paid somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars of cash bail, and freed hundreds of individuals at this town where the Commons was. I believe it was St. Louis. I wasn't there, in St. Louis. But since then, there's been a strong push within the denomination to say this is a systemic injustice that needs to change. Another one is payday lending. These, looking at systems that are in place and saying how are these not right, and how are they creating a systemic racism?
So that's and we don't have a whole lot of time left, but those are at individual issue levels, and it's not that those aren't important and that actions to help alleviate them don't matter. But isn't there a larger question about how do these come to be in the first place? I mean, there's some structural way of thinking that brings us to this point, and how do we change that? And you've got about a minute left to answer that one.
That's a good question. I think that the real, we look back and say, how did we get here? I think what I want to do is look forward and say, where are we on this arc now? Are we on an arc toward justice, or are we on an arc that is keeping us in that state of systemic injustice? And I would say that within the church, my goal is to be a part of that arc, because I believe that God is on this arc. Throughout Scripture, we look at the arc that arcs toward justice. And what did Martin Luther King said specifically about this?
The arc of history is long, but it bends towards
justice.
And Eric, we're out of time.
I
want to thank you for a fascinating conversation.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you,
And I
Kevin.
hope you'll come back.
I would love to.
Okay. So thank you once again for joining us on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Reverend Erik Khoobyarian. And I hope you'll join us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.